Welcome to the War Academy channel. Among all the elements that can characterize the Second World War, there is one that undoubtedly stands out above all the others, and is at the top of the list. We are referring to the famous German Tiger-type tank, which entered into action for the first time at the end of 1942, being the most advanced armored car of the moment. And it is that the popularity and notoriety that this battle tank reached was not comparable to that of any other, even creating the so-called Tiger phobia, which was basically a state of panic in which the Allied crews could enter when they had to face against an armor of this type. Although this myth is obviously fueled in part by war propaganda, it is an irrefutable fact that this tank carried out actions never seen before. In today's program, we are going to see the history of the two most lethal heavy panzer battalions in the entire German army, these being the 502nd and 503rd Battalions. And it is that, as we will now see, the first of them reached the figure of 1,400 enemy armored cars killed, and the second reached 1,700. To briefly go into the origin of these units, we have to go back to the summer of 1942, when these first heavy battalions were created. At first, the idea was that these units should be made up of about 25 Tigers and another 25 Panzers III, the task of the former being to face the enemy tanks taking advantage of their superiority, while the Panzers III, they would act as support, performing exploration and reconnaissance tasks. The objective was to create a small, very powerful, and flexible formation, capable of providing support in the most critical areas of the front. A few months later, by March 1943, the number of Tigers that these battalions should have was raised to 45, and being independent units, and therefore not being assigned to any division, their most frequent mission was to go moving to those points of enemy penetration, to try to shore them up. Before beginning with the history of the 502nd Battalion, we must finally say that many of these units were being re-equipped from the summer of 1944, with Tiger II type battle tanks, or other heavy German armor, but their structure and the objective that these units had, as a general rule, was maintained. Having seen these issues, let's start with the one that was the unit with the best numbers of the entire contest. As we have said before, this formation reached the figure of 1,400 enemy casualties, due to the loss of only 107 Tigers, which gives us a ratio of more than 13-1. The history of this 502nd Heavy Battalion begins on May 25, 1942, when it was formed, but it was not until mid-August when the unit received its first 4 Tigers. Quickly, they were sent to the Leningrad area, where this new tank made its first appearance on the Eastern Front. The first steps of this battalion were quite painful, because its crews had practically not had time to use the armor for the first time, and because it was new, it had many mechanical failures to correct. To give us an idea, of this first batch of 4 Tigers sent to Leningrad, 3 of them broke down between the route of the station where they had been unloaded, and their assembly area. Little by little, more armored vehicles arrived in the area, until 2 companies could be formed, the second being sent urgently to the Rostov area, to stop the Soviet advance in January 1943. It was here that this unit fully entered combat against Soviet tanks, wreaking havoc wherever they clashed. On the other hand, the first company that remained in the Leningrad sector was also fighting fiercely in containing the Soviet Polar Star offensive. After weeks of intense combat, the front gradually calmed down, and as of March, it was stabilized. This battalion had had some very good performances, but had been very worn out, so I took advantage of these months until July to recover. The main advantage that this new panzer offered the Germans was the ability to shoot down Soviet armor at far greater distances than any other tank in their arsenal could hitherto. Also, due to its advanced optics, the Tiger had a lethal aim. This new situation forced the Soviets to have to launch their armor in an accelerated and rushed manner against the German panzer formations, with the aim of closing the distance that separated them as soon as possible. As usual, this made them make many mistakes that they paid dearly for. The 502nd Battalion continued to fight during the late 1943s around Leningrad, stopping all Soviet offensives in the area, until finally, by the beginning of 1944, they had to retreat. At the end of February, they were helped to establish the new German defensive line on the Narva River, by which time they had only 17 Tigers. There they would continue in a series of defensive combats until in July, they would be overcome by the different Soviet offensives. It was specifically on September 26 when the battalion reached the mark of 1,000 destroyed enemy armor in its combats in the vicinity of Riga. Shortly after, part of the unit was isolated in the Courland pocket, although its members would be evacuated and sent to Germany to be re-equipped with Tiger II. In early January, the 502nd Battalion, reconstituted as the 511th, was located in East Prussia. Once the Soviets launch their offensive on the Vistula, the unit will be mainly fixated on the fighting around the city of Königsberg and will slowly succumb, while continuing to wreak havoc on the Soviet armor. In addition to this sector, his 3rd Company was assigned to the Ruhr area, for which it was reinforced with 8 new Tiger II, and it was there that it would finally surrender. As we said at the beginning, this unit finished the war with a total mark of 1,400 tanks killed and losses of 107, giving us a ratio of 13-1. As a final curiosity, it was precisely in this battalion that the famous Otto fought. Carius, contributing to the formation more than 100 victories, and it was also this unit, the first to lose a Tiger in the Leningrad sector, which was quickly captured and studied by the Soviets. Having analyzed Battalion 502, let us now see which was the most lethal battalion, which was not the most effective. This is explained because while the 502 managed to shoot down 1,400 enemy armor, the 503 reached the figure of 1,700. However, he suffered a total loss of 252 Tigers, which gives us a ratio of 6.75-1. The history of this Heavy Panzer Battalion begins on April 16, 1942, the day it was formed. The first peculiarity of this unit is that it was not formed with normal replacement personnel, but rather veterans from different panzer divisions were assigned to it. The first destination for the 503rd Battalion while they were training was to be North Africa. However, due to how critical the situation was getting on the Eastern Front, they were sent there in late 1942. Their mission was to keep a free corridor in the vicinity of Rostov, which would allow the withdrawal of all the German divisions that came from the Caucasus. After a month and a half of heavy fighting, the battalion had been depleted, and was sent to the rear to recover and re-equip. Once it was ready again at the end of April, with its 45 Tigers in full, it was placed under the orders of Manstein to participate in the Citadel operation on Korsk. The different companies of the battalion, which comprised about 15 Tigers each, were divided into different divisions of the Southern Pincer, and began the offensive on July 5. These armored vehicles were of great help when it came to overcoming the defensive lines, and in direct confrontation with the continuous battle tanks that the Soviets sent to stop the German advance. Once the offensive fails, the 503rd Tigers will be involved in a series of defensive battles that will gradually push them towards the Dnieper. When the battalion arrived on the banks of this river at the end of 1943, it had lost all its Tigers, so it had to be re-equipped by the beginning of 1944, with another 45 newly arrived Panzer SIXs. It was in these first months of the year 44, when the unit was being subordinated to other larger formations, but it was also when it stood out the most in its combats with the Soviet armored formations. And it is that only during that month of February, the figure of more than 600 destroyed enemy tanks was credited. By March and April 1944, the Soviet avalanche is overwhelming and the situation becomes more and more critical, to the point that Manstein himself is dismissed and Model is put in his place. After having been severely decimated in these battles, the remaining men of the 503rd were sent to Germany to be reinforced and re-equipped with 45 Tiger IIs. Later, in June of that same year, they would fight in the Normandy area, in an attempt to keep the front stable. After weeks of fighting, in which the unit lost much armor to air raids, what little remained of the battalion had to be sent back to Germany in September to recover. After further training, the 503rd, with another 45 Tiger II, were sent to Hungary, in an attempt to keep the country under German control. There they would later go on to fight in the battles for the Hungarian capital of Budapest, which they finally failed to recover during the first weeks of 1945. From there, they had no choice but to gradually retreat towards Prague, with very few operational tanks. Despite having hardly any fuel or ammunition, what remains of the battalion continues to cause casualties to the Soviets as late as April 13 and 19, in which they will shoot down more than 30 Soviet armor. On April 28, the unit's most famous character, Kursk fell in combat while covering the westward retreat of the remnants of his battalion. On May 10, the 400 remaining men of the 503rd managed to reach the American lines and surrender to them, although a few days later, they are placed under Soviet control. In addition to Nispel, other famous men in this unit included Heinz Rondorf, who scored 106 enemy armor destroyed, and Heinz Gardner, who scored 103. As we said at the beginning, the unit's total count during these years of combat was 1,700 enemy casualties for 252 losses. However, let us not think that all German heavy battalions performed the same. To give an example, the 508th Battalion managed to destroy only 100 enemy armor for 78 losses, or the 504th reached the mark of 250 killed for 109 losses. The total ratio of all these battalions, in which we also include those of the Waffen-SS that we will see in the future, was 5.74 battle tanks destroyed for each of theirs. And what do you think? Do you think that these types of vehicles were decisive? Or that other simpler models had to be chosen, as many people think? I await your answers in the description. And well, this video ends here. Thank you all very much, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.